What makes a story a Splatoon story? Well, first you need a squid, an octopus, and a fish. Okay, what next? Well, you tell the squid and the octopus that they should hate each other and watch as they start fighting over the fish. But what makes that story good? Oh, you know, throw in some politics and war and punk rock and a woman. Then you convince millions of people in their teens to early 20s that this is a real thing that could actually happen someday. How do you do that? Lore. This is something I think about a lot. Don't ask me why, I'm not a therapist, but for whatever reason I find myself to be a person who loves engaging in heated discourse about the squid and the octopus and the fish. To word that in a way that sounds slightly less deranged, the lore of Splatoon has always been one of my favorite aspects of the series. Not just the plot and the characters, but the minute details that make up the setting that the squids and the octopuses call home. I expressed a lot of these thoughts in my video essay, Splatoon Story and What It Means to Be Human, but that video was more about how the evolving lore of the series managed to hit me like a semi-truck and isekai me into a life of making video essays about sea creature people. This one will be a bit more critical. Something you may have noticed in that video of mine is that, despite gouging literally any ounce of narrative I possibly could out of the first two games, I kind of danced around the actual meat and potatoes of Splatoon 3's story. Now that we are a number of months beyond the second of Splatoon 3's single-player experiences, I figured it might be time to start talking about them. And in case you can't tell, my opinions on them are much more mixed. I've been pondering for a long time what exactly it is about the stories of Splatoon 1 and 2 that I love so much and what Splatoon 3 lacked in comparison, and how I might word my thoughts on these games in a semi-comprehensible way instead of just going on rants about how Grizz was disappointing or whatever. I still don't have a perfect answer, and this is all, of course, very subjective, but I think I'm finally ready to cover in great detail everything I believe Splatoon 3's story does well, why certain parts of it let me down, why lore is important for adding depth and meaning to a narrative, and what all of this means for the future of storytelling in the Splatoon series. Let's talk about it. To give a clear picture of what I'm actually talking about here, I think it's worth going over how Splatoon's world and narrative have developed differently across each campaign. Don't worry, it won't be over an hour this time, but I think this context is important for establishing my own perspective on the games and the mindset I had going into Splatoon 3. Splatoon 1 introduced us to the fundamental world building of the setting, post-human apocalypse, intelligent sea life living on the surface, and a conflict of interest between them. This is the fish part if you've been following along. Splatoon 1's lore was really cool because at first it painted its video game enemies in an irrefutably bad light. It told us we were the good guys, those were the bad guys, and that was that. But the more you looked into the world of the game, the more signs you were given that this was not actually the case. The Inklings and the Octarians were just two different groups of people, and we were being shown the perspective of one of those groups. There were no heroes or villains, just differing perspectives and cultures. Producer Hisashi Nogami said as much in an interview with Nintendo Life, which I somehow never brought up in my giant video essay. This was important because it meant that Splatoon's major conflicts were inherently complex and surprisingly realistic. The enemies weren't just enemies, they were people with an opposing perspective, one that was forged through a different cultural landscape and propaganda. It was neat, and something unlike any other story told by Nintendo. Time marched on, and Splatoon 2 came out. Now, normally when I bring up this game's story, I'm pretty lukewarm on it, but I do think it has some merit. The shifting relationship of the Squid sisters was a nice way to make them feel more relatable and down to earth, and seeing them reunite at the end of the game was a lot of fun. In terms of the bigger picture though, the story didn't really change the way I viewed Splatoon's world. I did find it interesting that all of these characters were willing to go through the motions and repeat basically the exact same conflict that happened in the previous game, but that also made it a bit less believable, and I definitely would have preferred if it strayed further from what Splatoon 1 had already done. Again though, the dynamic between major groups of people was still there. Marie spoke about the Octarians like they were video game enemies, while the lore insisted that they were in fact real people. To me, this was fascinating because it gave a ton of depth to Splatoon's world and its central conflicts, even if they appeared generic and uninspired at first glance. Of course, where the developers really hit it out of the park was Octo Expansion, which brought the depth of this dynamic to the surface. The story was now about one of those video game enemies, and that video game enemy was now presented as an actual person. Octo Expansion was captivating and cathartic as a dedicated Splatoon fan because it was exactly what we had been waiting for. It was weirdly vindicating to see these things addressed by the actual plot, and in a way that not only felt tasteful, but powerful. Importantly, it gave us 8, a silent protagonist who actually had a lot to say, and who made every step of the journey to the Promised Land feel rewarding and empowering. Octo Expansion allowed us to challenge the dynamic of Splatoon's world by taking its flaws into our own hands, and that's why the finale of this campaign was so unbelievably satisfying. If Octo Canyon was the start of Splatoon 2, this was the end, a proper send-off to everything the series had done up to that point. Frankly, I don't know if we'll ever get something like it again. The only problem with this ending is that it felt like an ending. I didn't really have any idea where the narrative of Splatoon might go after Octo Expansion. Off the Hook finally got their story, Inklings and Octolings seem to have largely made peace, and most of the game's mysteries and conflicts had been pretty much resolved. Everything really came full circle, and it's at this point in Splatoon's lifespan that I personally began to actually think about what these stories meant. Paraphrasing quite a bit, I concluded in my video essay that the Inklings and Octolings were a reflection of humankind. They were and continue to be what the developers see as the future of the human race. Something flawed, volatile, hedonistic, but also creative, joyous, and free. The lore of Splatoon, in my eyes, allows us to not only escape reality and enter fiction, but look beyond our own present into a proposed future crafted by the developers. Like many games and works of art, it is a reflection of the developers' views on the world, but it is also something that lives in real time, evolving and changing as each new piece of the narrative unfolds. This impression of the passage of time works partially due to Splatoon's events and updates, but also because of the game's setting. Splatoon's world is our world 12,000 years in the future. Its history is believable because it builds upon itself in addition to reality. Should we suspend our disbelief, we are meant to believe that this society rose from the ashes of the real planet Earth, a place where real humans lived and real humans died. By setting Splatoon in the future, the developers essentially take the entire history of humankind, our planet, and the universe and declare it to be canon lore within their own world. What I find so captivating about Splatoon in particular, though, is that it doesn't just use its futuristic setting to justify the unique elements of its world, but also acknowledges that existing history. The consequences of this being a place humanity once inhabited are not ignored, and this allows the real world to essentially appear and invade the fictional world of the game, in some cases quite literally. By designing the Inklings and Octolings to reflect humanity and allowing them to interact with pieces of our past, Splatoon is able to comment on human history, behaviors, and modern culture. Of course, there are some things in Splatoon that do go unexplained. Gameplay systems and small details that don't quite add up with the world we've been shown. But for the most part, this setting manages to somehow be pretty convincing. You can just feel how much energy the developers have put into imagining all of the ways the Inklings and Octolings live their lives, down to ceremonial dances, weapon manufacturing, fashion trends, cereal brands, squid-shaped zippers and fruit, fictional Twitter drama, whatever you could possibly think of, the developers have probably thought of it too. It's a world that oozes creativity and is so clearly made with a deep love and appreciation for real-life cultures, and naturally that makes the stories told in this world so much richer. These locations are believable because these characters, these objects, these advertisements, they aren't just set dressing, they're history. They're all equal parts that make up the illusion of this fictional space. For me, this is the entire appeal of Splatoon outside of the gameplay. Being obsessed with Splatoon lore has always been about not just understanding the background of a fictional society, but understanding how it connects and relates to our own. At the core of my passion for the Splatoon series is this idea that Splatoon's world is canonically the real world and thematically used to comment on the real world. With that established, I would like to finally start talking about Splatoon 3. To put it simply, Splatoon 3's story broke this illusion. At several points, it seems to completely disregard the 7 years of lore that preceded it. And beyond that, it's just a messy, confused narrative that juggles too many ideas and characters without properly committing to any of them. I can easily say that Return of the Mammalians is my least favorite story in the series. Now, I am fully aware that some people will vehemently disagree with me already, but I also know that others will probably take my side. From what I've seen, this story has been extremely divisive in the community, with some people loving it, while others...
Fuck off!
Not so much. I've discussed the successes and failures of the story with many different people over the past 2 years, and I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of what made it compelling to some and repulsive to others. Of course, at the end of the day, what I express in this video will be my own opinion, but even if you loved Splatoon 3's story, I ask that you hear me out. I'm not here to be a hater without reason. This story disappointed me not because it was downright awful, but because I think it had extraordinary potential that it just didn't reach. So why did I find it disappointing? Splatoon 3's story, in my opinion, failed to perpetuate the idea of believable settings, characters, and conflict. Let's start with the least offensive of these 3 elements: setting. I actually have a lot of positive things to say here. Alterna is a fascinating ruin of humankind, contrasting fun gameplay with contemplative melancholy. The lore we are given for this setting fits in well with everything we knew about Splatoon's world prior, and even expands on some established concepts. We are finally given a reason for the rapid rise of the Inkling and Octoling species, and a greater understanding of their motives and culture. In addition, we are told the tragic story of the Alternan people, the last survivors of the human race, and how they destroyed themselves in a desperate attempt to cling to the past. While I personally don't love how bluntly this information is conveyed compared to a more cryptic lore device like the Sunken Scrolls, I think this is, for the most part, Splatoon lore done right. It doesn't pull punches in regards to darker elements, it enforces the connection between the cephalopods and humanity, and importantly, it enriches the experience of the entire game by providing context for its setting and adding weight to the player's actions. But the overworld of the Alterna Dome is only a single part of Splatoon 3's narrative. The story of the Alternan people is genuinely compelling, but it completely fails to explain our journey through most of the actual game. Every single level up to the game's finale takes place not in these ruins, but inside of a distinct testing facility underneath the city. My question is, what are these tests actually for? Why are they filled with technology invented and used by the Inkfish? Where did all of these Octarian kettles come from, and why do they connect to these places that were supposedly made by humans? The Alterna logs never tell us, so we just don't know. Shockingly, the Alterna logs also lack any information about the game's enemies, despite the Octarians being the central focus of the previous story and crucial to the entire Splatoon canon up to this point. In Splatoon 3, they're barely spoken about. This time around, there's nothing to humanize them or show their perspective. There's not even anything to explain why they're obeying Mr. Grizz or why we're fighting against them. As far as the game is concerned, they aren't people anymore. They're just video game enemies. The logs only explain one half of the setting. Sure, this lore adds weight and purpose to our actions in the upper dome, but the rest of the time we're mindlessly killing mammalian Octarians without any clue why we're doing it. To me, this is kind of baffling. Octo Expansion, paired with Splatoon 1, felt so dedicated to making all of its characters feel real. They came from different places, they were taught about the world in different ways. They weren't perfect, there was tension, assumptions, awkwardness, embarrassment, but they learned to empathize with one another. They overcame their struggles, they found confidence in their identities. We weren't just going through the motions to beat up a bad guy. We were defying age-old systems of oppression to claim our freedom. Return of the Mammalians lacks this kind of writing entirely, and on some level that makes sense. This is a different story than Octo Expansion, and it doesn't have to use the same devices to add depth to its narrative. In general, I would say Return of the Mammalians aims to be much more plot-driven than character-focused. It lacks elements like the mem cakes and the chat logs that gave us insight into the thoughts and feelings of specific characters, in favor of higher-level lore that instead describes the broad history of the story setting. But that doesn't excuse its complete disinterest in contextualizing the main gameplay loop of the campaign. In Octo Expansion, we took tests designed by Kamaboko to evaluate our abilities as a subject. We did this to progress through the Deep Sea Metro and collect the Thangs in order to be granted access to the Promised Land by Commander Tartar. In Return of the Mammalians, we take tests designed by, someone for some reason in order to progress through Alterna and collect the treasures for some reason and do something with them that might save Cuttlefish. Do you see the issue here? I wouldn't even call this lore, it's just basic information that makes the story feel empty in its absence. Ironically, it's Splatoon 3's insistence on reusing past ideas that makes it feel oddly out of place, because unlike in the other games, these concepts return without a clear purpose and often without much iteration. Octo Expansion had test chambers, so Splatoon 3 does too. You fought Octarians in all the other games, so why not again? The game pulls in tons of ideas from past entries, whether it be gameplay mechanics, story elements, or both, and just copy-paste them, seemingly without a clear understanding of why they actually worked in the past. The problem is that none of these things existed in a vacuum. You can't have Octarians without the Great Turf War and sanitization. You can't have test chambers without Kamaboko. If you do, you better have a good reason for it. And unfortunately, Splatoon 3 doesn't. I just claimed that Splatoon 3 is largely a plot-driven story. We don't really learn anything new about the Squid sisters or Captain 3, we get basically nothing at all for the new Agent 3, and Deep Cut's exposition is pretty minimal too. That's not inherently a bad thing, and not something any Splatoon story dives too deep into, besides Octo Expansion, but here's the thing. The plot of this game makes no sense. We fall into Alterna and learn that Cuttlefish is missing. We start clearing tests because it allows us to progress through Alterna and look for him. But then, Deep Cut appears and tells us they're looting the place for treasure. Okay, who cares? We go back to clearing tests. Callie and Marie think Cuttlefish is where Deep Cut is. He isn't. Doesn't matter, we fight them anyway. For literally no reason, we take the unidentifiable thing they had, then we do this 2 more times despite having no clear overlying motivation besides trying to find Cuttlefish, who we know is not going to be there. Finally, we realize Cuttlefish is in the rocket, so we use the things we collected for no reason to remove an obstacle we didn't know existed. Deep Cut realizes we only wanted the things we took from them temporarily, and suddenly they want to help us save Cuttlefish? At this point, Mr. Grizz begins telling us about his plan. Apparently, Cuttlefish has some kind of essence, which Mr. Grizz needs, so he removes it from his mind. When we reach Cuttlefish, he appears dried out, but there's no further mention of what that essence was or why Mr. Grizz needed it. So we never even really learn why Mr. Grizz captured Cuttlefish. Instead, Mr. Grizz tells us that he's going to cover the planet in fuzzy ooze, turning all living things into mammals. He launches the rocket, which is filled with ooze, setting his plan into motion. The captain sheds a tear on Cuttlefish's dried body, which revives him. I'm not even going to touch on that part. Deep Cut shows up in person because apparently they weren't just with the Squid sisters. They launch us into space using a shark riding a tornado because, sure, why not? We land on the rocket and we begin the fight against Mr. Grizz. Grizz blasts us off the rocket at the last second, only for DJ Octavio to spontaneously appear out of nowhere and save us. The idols begin singing the Calamari incantation, which transforms Small Fry into a salmon kaiju? This was kinda foreshadowed by a sunken scroll, but there hasn't ever been this kind of straight-up magic in Splatoon's world before, so it still comes pretty much completely out of nowhere. Regardless, we defeat Grizz, blow up the rocket before it can hit the Earth, and Small Fry goes back to normal. The end. Look, previous Splatoon stories were extremely simple in their execution, but at no point did they ever feel quite this aimless. We collected Zapfish to destroy bosses and further invade Octarian territory. We passed tests to collect Thangs and escape the Deep Sea Metro. For most of Splatoon 3, we're looking for Cuttlefish, but no tangible progress is actually made toward this goal until the very end of the story, making everything we do before this moment entirely pointless. And despite this serving as the main motivation of the protagonist, this scene doesn't provide any payoff because we never learn what it was all for. Some have praised this boss fight for its spectacle, but it reaches a level of absurdity that I personally just don't find very fitting for Splatoon. I get the impression that the developers didn't really care if this made any sense. And you might say that's on me for attempting to find the logic in a boss fight as ridiculous as this, but previous Splatoon stories managed to be over the top while still feeling consistent with the rest of the game. They were grounded in lore that, in my opinion, made their events more meaningful. And I have to wonder, if they weren't going to follow in Octo Expansion's footsteps by focusing at least partially on the history and relationships of the story's characters, Why have so many characters? Alterna is a well-realized space with a solid history, but most of the people we interact with don't seem to really care about it. The Squid Sisters are here because, I don't know, Splatoon fans like the Squid Sisters? It's certainly not because they serve an important role in the narrative. Sure, the new Squidbeak Splatoon has made it their job to take care of Octarian threats, but what do Callie and Marie actually add to this story besides standing around looking cute? Deep Cut is here not because they have any interest in Alterna, but because they want to help the less fortunate back in Splatsville. That's cool and all, but nothing they do here is particularly relevant to the story of the Alternans. Nothing is even really done with the dynamic between them and the Squid Sisters. We only fight Deep Cut due to these characters thinking their goals are at odds with one another when they literally aren't. At the end of the game, the characters realize this and immediately become friends, but there wasn't any growth throughout the story to suggest that this couldn't have happened at the very beginning. We don't even know our own reason for collecting the treasures and thus fighting Deep Cut. So why are we fighting? Why does any of what conspires between the new Squidbeak Splatoon and Deep Cut happen at all? I think there's an attempt at a character arc here, but all Shiver, Fry, and Big Man learn in the end is that they made a false assumption. This entire B-plot, if you could even call it that, does nothing for the overall narrative or themes of the game. Deep Cut exists in the game's finale, but they could easily be replaced by anyone else and it wouldn't make a difference because they don't interact with the antagonist. The members of Deep Cut on their own are fun characters, but while the idol groups in past stories served as motivators for the main plot or aided the central themes of the story, Deep Cut and the Squid Sisters don't do much of anything to make me care about them here. It's a case of style, but literally no substance. And that's not even the worst of it. DJ Octavio is in this game. If you forgot, I don't blame you. Seems like the developers did too. Despite him and his giant mech falling into Alterna alongside us, he straight up disappears for the entire game. The team-up moment during the final boss is cool, and the novelty of controlling what was previously a final boss is not lost on me, but I can easily say this would have been a million times more impactful if Octavio could have actually been a part of the narrative rather than just a tutorial and a bit of fan service. Orca is here as yet another tutorial character for some reason. As an artificial intelligence made by the humans, and the only character to actually acknowledge the existence of the test chambers, you could say Orca is meant to help flesh out Alterna. The thing is, we never learn anything about it. It doesn't even have a clear motive for telling us Alterna's history. It's basically a system text box pretending to be a supporting cast member. That makes 11 characters. Each person here technically has a purpose in the narrative, but in most cases it's just not a particularly interesting one, and the lore doesn't do much to support or justify their inclusions. A lot of them are just kinda here, providing gameplay support or serving as gameplay obstacles, but not really contributing to the story being told. If this story was longer or more focused on building up these characters and having them interact in more interesting ways, maybe 11 characters would have been fine. But this is a game you can beat in 2 hours, and it doesn't have any of that. I personally think this cast is excessive, and often takes away from the actual narrative the game is trying to tell. That being the story of the Alternans and Mr. Grizz. Mr. Grizz is undoubtedly the most important character in Return of the Mammalians. As the antagonist, Grizz is the story's namesake, the source of the game's central conflict, and the main medium through which its themes are communicated. The entire plot is basically just there to set up our face-to-face encounter with the bear himself. And unfortunately, for me, he was the final nail in the coffin. It's difficult to articulate just why Mr. Grizz bothers me so much to people who aren't equally familiar with the lore of Splatoon. I totally get that it seems silly to complain about a talking bear in a game with talking sea creatures. But, as dumb as it sounds, this is a world in which talking squids and octopuses are very well established. There is a science fiction explanation for how they came into existence, and a complex world that primarily features their cultures and societies. The Inklings and Octolings aren't just talking animals for the hell of it. These are characters whose world and history are taken seriously. As I established earlier, Splatoon's world is a future version of our own reality, one in which the squids and octopuses serve as a reflection of humanity. And in no game is this made more clear than Splatoon 3. This game introduced the idea that Inkling and Octoling evolution was influenced by the passive desires of humankind. In a way, they are the closest thing to human descendants, literally reflecting our will millennia after our death. So this isn't something that was retconned, in fact it was leaned into. To me, this was the developers saying yes, the parallels between the Inkfish and humankind are intentional. It was them saying they want us to view their stories as both cautionary tales and beacons of hope, a representation of humanity's struggles and triumphs, both our hatred and our love. The Inklings and Octolings are two fictional species, crafted in our image, continuing our legacy, for better or worse. And then there's Mr. Grizz. A talking bear with cartoony proportions from the era of the humans. Tell me I'm not the only one who thinks this just feels wrong. See now, I've seen a lot of people say they found Grizz's reveal to be disappointing because, for a character who was always known for being cloaked in mystery, his design ended up being very obvious. He's literally just a bear. But for me, it was actually the opposite. I thought it was obvious that Mr. Grizz couldn't be a bear because it wouldn't make any sense within Splatoon's setting. The signs that he was a bear seemed like the most obvious red herrings in the world. Because this is Splatoon, it's not just a generic cartoon world full of talking animals, it's a science fiction story about highly evolved sea creatures. More than that, it's a story about characters who represent humanity, culturally and visually. Mr. Grizz being a literal bear is disappointing not just because it's kind of lame, but because it damages the otherwise carefully constructed dynamic of Splatoon's setting. It makes this world less believable. It breaks the illusion that Splatoon's past is our present, and it confuses the series' core messaging about what it means to be human. This is why lore matters. Everything in Splatoon would be ridiculous and meaningless without the foundation that Splatoon's story is a world beyond humanity. Without that base, it's just a story about squids and octopuses fighting over fish, or in this case, a lonely bear who wants people to look like him. Grizz is a deeper character than that, but he doesn't work for me because his fundamental lore simply isn't good enough. Earlier, I said the Alternalogs were Splatoon lore done right, and that's because they tell us what we need to know. Alterna transforms from a big dome with funny moai statues into a tragic relic of the past. The solemn history of a forgotten people, a world unknown to us and the Inklings. It's a stepping stone that strengthens our relationship and adds meaning to our adventure. But then there's log.exe, the origin story of Mr. Grizz. Grizz isn't a normal bear, that much is made clear, but what exactly is he? How did he come to be like this? And what is he doing in Splatoon? In my opinion, that's what log.exe needed to tell us, and in my opinion, it failed. Mr. Grizz was an experimental subject on the Ark Polaris. Like the other passengers, he was cryogenically frozen for 12,000 years. Upon the ship's re-entry and subsequent crash, Grizz was the only survivor. Okay, that explains how a bear can be alive in the time of Splatoon, but it fails to address everything else. Why does Grizz have human-like intelligence? Hell, why can he talk? There's so much surface-level information that just isn't provided. What makes this so annoying is that all of the pieces are there. Grizz is said to have been an experimental subject, and he was apparently awake for the 12,000 years he was in cryo-sleep. However that works. But neither of those things really work as explanations on their own, and neither are explicitly said to be the origin of his intelligence. Apparently he just dreamed for a long time, and that somehow made him smart enough to do literal rocket science? Grizz is the main antagonist of the game, and he's a character who requires explanation to make any amount of sense within Splatoon's universe. I really don't think it's nitpicking to say there should have been more here. As I tried to drill in earlier, the entire appeal of the Splatoon franchise to me is its attention to detail. The developers of Splatoon explain things as big as the death and legacy of humanity, and as small as, hey, I wonder who made this graffiti sticker, let's get an entire interview with them please? No character is as foreign to Splatoon as Mr. Grizz. His entire arc and design is built around the fact that he doesn't fit in. But personally, I think having a proper backstory to explain how he ended up here would have only benefited his character and emphasized his otherness even more. As it is currently, Grizz doesn't make sense, and not in a way that feels intentionally mysterious, but just poorly thought out. The thing is, I don't even think Mr. Grizz is a bad character. A YouTuber by the name Sir Dame Sander has a fantastic and incredibly underrated video on their channel that highlights very succinctly everything I believe Grizz does well. Their video honestly gave me a much greater appreciation of the character, and you should definitely check it out. In summary, Sir Dame Sander mostly focuses on all the ways that Grizz is not a bear. The fact that he seemingly lacks any internal body structure, his ability to transform into liquid and survive in space. To them, this matters because it shows us that Grizz isn't actually a mammal, at least not anymore. The experiments he conducted on his own body changed him irreversibly. In his desperate attempts to bring back what had been dead and buried for thousands of years, Grizz's own identity was compromised. Every other Splatoon antagonist has deep roots within their respective settings. DJ Octavio holds power and influence over the Octarian people. Commander Tartar believes it can restore the late humans, and Order was born from the desires of its creators. Mr. Grizz has nothing and no one. He is a lone creature in a world that is not his own. Conceptually, he stands out as the only character in Splatoon with no sense of community or purpose. He is truly alone, unable to relate to the inkfish of the present, but also too unlike the mammals of the past. He is hopelessly determined to restore the world he once knew, not because he believes it was truly superior or that this is the correct thing to do, but because it's all he can do. Grizz deludes himself for his own sanity. He cannot come to terms with the fact that there is no one like him. At the end of his arc, Grizz understands that the world he dreams of cannot exist. He finally sees the beauty of the present and understands that it is wrong to destroy it. In his final moment, he thematically embodies the acceptance and celebration of change, the reigning philosophy of the Splatoon 2 player base, and arguably one of the central principles of the series. The reason it's so hard for me to shrug off Mr. Grizz's lore isn't because he's an outright poorly written character. It's because he had the potential to be so much more. Conceptually and thematically, Grizz is absolutely compelling, and I do think it's worth appreciating those aspects of his character. It's just the execution of these ideas that falls flat. Grizz's reveal at the finale is awkward and confusing. The game tries to build a sense of tension and mystery up to this point, but it doesn't have a good answer for any of the questions it raises. How did Grizz abduct Octavio's entire army? Why do the Fuzzy Octarians obey him? What the hell is Essence? The way this scene plays out, I feel like I'm expected to suddenly understand everything about Alterna and Mr. Grizz, but I don't. Grizz's reveal doesn't explain the Alternan tests, it doesn't explain Orca's motivations, and it barely explains the Fuzzy Octarians. For all of these disparate story elements to make any amount of sense, Grizz needed to be the through line that tied them together. The entire narrative hinges on this one moment, and in my opinion, it fails to deliver. Return of the Mammalians excels when it commits to its own ideas. When it isn't focused on idols or test chambers or the Octarians, it paints a clear picture of what happened to Alterna and its people. It builds a fascinating connection between the late humans and the characters we play as, and it could have featured one of the most interesting and meaningful characters in the series, one who embodies a theme chosen by the players themselves. These ideas aren't bad on paper, but with them only being half developed and constantly interrupted, they just don't end up coming together. The best parts of Return of the Mammalians are the things that are completely unique to it, and in its greatest moments, it forges an identity almost as distinct and realized as Octo Expansion. But that identity is muddied by everything else. An excessive cast, a confused plot, and a lack of context for the game's own events and characters. Especially for a story that was meant to conclude the saga of the first 3 Splatoon games, it feels oddly irreverent of the events and arcs of previous entries, with a narrative that was certainly different, but not in a way that felt climactic as much as it felt random and unrelated to what came before. The story in isolation is one thing, but as the final cap on the Splatoon trilogy, for me it was massively, and I mean massively, disappointing. And it's not just because Grizz was a bear or because the levels were too easy, but because it truly felt like something was lost in the transition from Splatoon 2 to 3. Return of the Mammalians just didn't live up to the previous game's high standard for attention to detail. This world that I had grown up alongside, that had only gotten better and more fleshed out over time, was now beginning to show some cracks. This idea that Splatoon stories are only as good as their lore may not sit well with some people, and I understand that. For many, as long as the fun writing, grand presentation, and overall narrative themes are in place, they can enjoy the story well enough. But for someone like me, who fell in love with this series because its most interesting elements are the ones you have to uncover, the understated details, the deep dark underbelly of this world, this is the part that matters. I love and respect what Splatoon 3 tries to be, but what it offers is simply not enough. Its biggest moments are ruined for me because they don't make an ounce of sense within the setting they are being told, and I get the sense that there wasn't as strong a vision for this game as there were for the past two. Trust me, I want to love this story. I really wish I could appreciate Mr. Grizz for his role as the opposition to change in a game all about moving forward, but his presentation, dialogue, and most importantly his lore were just disappointing. Splatoon 3 has a busy story. It tries to handle several characters and ideas at the same time, and its prioritization of goofy writing over lore that actually explains what is happening in the plot leaves it feeling thematically confused and spread thin. While the setting is compelling and aesthetically impressive, crucial parts of it are left completely unexplained. References to past stories, like kettles and test chambers and Octarian enemies, feel less like elaborations on those concepts and more like the developers were just reusing content for the sake of it. The plot of the game is confusing. Most of the characters have little, if any, motivation for the actions they take, and there are so many of them that no one really gets a chance to shine. Mr. Grizz and the game's central conflict feel underdeveloped. Grizz's motivations are provided in a post-game collectible long after the story's climax, and even then, this information feels less than satisfactory. The means to carry out his plan are also dubious, due to us never learning about the inconsistencies of Fuzzy Ooze or the nature of the Fuzzy Octarian. Mr. Grizz is a character who could have been so much more, but in my opinion fails to live up to expectations. Splatoon 3's story mode ended up being my least favorite part of the game, which for a person like me was obviously unfortunate. But that doesn't mean all of Splatoon 3 lacks interesting lore. Deep Cut has actually gotten a lot of great characterization outside of this story. Characters and locations from previous entries are mentioned by name or return in full form. New multiplayer maps have come with their own unique details, new events add to Splatoon's living history, and as this world continues to expand, it still feels like Splatoon. I still love this game, and while it does sting to get a story like this right after Octo Expansion, it obviously hasn't killed my interest in the series. In fact, we've already seen what the developers could do given a second chance. Splatoon 3 Side Order released back in February, and I thought it was great. Due to it being a roguelite, Side Order didn't have a lot going on in terms of plot, but I actually loved how it managed to tie together its own setting, its own characters, and its own conflict. I plan to save most of my thoughts about Side Order for another video, but I actually think it succeeded in many places Return of the Mammalians failed. Like I just said though, that's for another time. My disappointment with Return of the Mammalians is something that's been on my mind for a long time, and if you've been to my live streams or know me personally, you know just how insane Mr. Grizz made me. Part of the reason it took me so long to make this is because I was pretty reluctant to make what would inevitably be a mostly negative video, especially when there's more than enough of those to go around. In the end though, I realized that this series is very important to me, and I wanted to express my thoughts once they had fully crystallized. I know many people will outright disagree with my points in this video, while others will still love the story despite its flaws, and that's totally okay. I'm always looking for more reasons to appreciate Splatoon, so if you would like to share the way you feel in the comments, I encourage it. Just please remember to be civil. That's it for now. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end, and I hope you have a fantastic day. This has been Cosmic. Farewell.